Welcome to another episode of Out of the Blank podcast. I'm here with Mindy.
Hi, thank you
Mindy,
for having me.
I'm all right. So I'm very curious because your YouTube channel, for everyone out there listening, it's not just Plato quotes though, but it's more like of a walkthrough. Do you think it's more of your perspective? Like, what is it exactly?
Are you talking about the YouTube channel or the
Yes.
Twitter? The
Um.
YouTube channel?
Yeah.
Okay, so first of all, Twitter is like just Plato quotes. So I pull out quotes from Plato, sometimes from some of the later Platonists, but usually Plato. And I put like one or two a week out. And but on the YouTube channel, that's the one I really put a lot of time into. That one is I'm presenting Plato's dialogues. I'm going through each dialogue. I'm up to the last one. I'm going through the laws. So there are like 30 dialogues up there now. And each one I go through it, pulling out some quotes to give kind of like think of it as like just like steps along the way, and then you connect the dots. So it can help a person who's reading the dialogue better understand what's going on. Because the way that I read Plato is very different, I think, from the way it's usually presented in universities. I was fortunate enough to meet a teacher who is, I would say, a fully enlightened teacher, and someone who recognizes in Plato a philosophical way of life that is really deeply rooted in spirituality. And so that's the way that I present the dialogues. And what I really want to show in this YouTube channel is the continuity of thought that runs through all of them.
I really appreciate that because when I try not to look too much into my guests because I like to learn a lot about it on the show as well too. But when I was watching some of your things and you were saying quotes by Plato I've never even heard before, which is like obviously he probably had a lot. He probably had a catalog of amazing things that he could put up on like a motivational poster or something. But I like to see how everyone's brain kind of gets attracted to the words that people use and how someone can pull meaning out of something. Because I mean, everyone today is trying to be a philosopher a lot of times, especially on Twitter. It's like I usually put up like a really deep tweet and then I like to end it with like a comedy thing or some type of thing that just completely erases the whole deep meaning of it. But if I had to ask you, which probably one of the Plato's quotes that probably you pulled out of the most, or maybe something that really resonated with you?
Oh, it's hard to pick just one, but here's one I haven't actually been put up yet. But from the dialogue Meno, he says that if we try to learn what we don't already know, we will be better and stronger than if we assume that what we don't know, we never can know and don't even try.
What do you think that?
And
What do
I
you?
really like the idea of constantly pushing ourselves to understand more. Like many people will talk about what is beyond human knowledge, what is beyond human ability to know. But where do you draw that line between what can be known with great difficulty and what is beyond knowing? And the longer I work with these dialogues and longer I engage in this lifestyle, the more I find myself pushing that line up and thinking that what it means to be human starts to expand as we go from thinking of ourselves as just physical, and then maybe we have soul, whatever that means. And then once we can engage in the realm of mind and we can know ourselves as spiritual beings, we start to expand our understanding of what it means to be human.
Do
Does
you
that make sense?
do you think at least from your analyzation of those quotes or maybe even things from the past, do you think that it's lost or do you think it's still here? Because I think it's still like the identity crisis that the world kind of faces today. I think that's because a lot of times we lose touch with our roots, not necessarily roots as in primal things, but more on an aspect of who we are as people. We kind of let these devices adopt our mentalities and kind of rent, like I guess, a space in your head. And I don't think it's Plato. I think it's Aristotle, the one that says to truly admit or to truly I'm gonna butcher it again, but it's like to truly admit that you know everything is to admit that you know nothing.
Mm.
And I've come across that recently. I've been taking a lot of time off social media. I use it just to post, but when I enter like a Twitter space or something to get a new perspective, because I love perspectives, I start to like have this fear inside of me where it's like I'm never going to know everything. I'm never going to
Right.
even scratch the surface of information out there, even if
Mhm.
it's wrong information or even if it's a different
Mhm.
perspective, if it's a conspiracy, if it's whatever. It's something that is now a constituted reality that that person has created in their own mind, especially with like UFO Twitter. When I'm hearing people talk about aliens and stuff, I'm like, oh my God, I've never even in my entire life,
Yeah.
I've never even thought of that. But it's just that I guess fear is not really in the sense of being scary. It's more in the sense of being amazed at the fact that there is so much information out there, which never is going to hinder my progress on learning.
Right. Well, it sounds like you're talking about knowledge as a breadth of knowing things here in our physical world. What I'm thinking of is more of like a depth, or maybe like a vertical or knowledge of how how deep can we go into the self to know the self. The Delphic oracle, that is really what guides all of Platonism, is know thyself. What is the self? Are we just physical beings? Are we mental beings? What does it mean to be a spiritual being?
What do you
And
think we are? Because if I had, I mean, I know we're more than physical, but
mhm,
I speak from a non-religious
mhm,
aspect of things. I get the
mhm,
importance of it. I think there's always nobody wants to know that they're just gone, or nobody wants to
mhm.
think that they're just gone. I'm actually jealous of people that can look at that religious aspect, but I've seen so many forms of meditation. I've spoken to people that
Mhm,
talk about psychedelics, and I've really talked to a lot of people about the inner
mhm,
self, I would say. I
mhm,
think we're more than knowledge. I think we're more than understanding, but I
mhm,
also find value in enhancing your spirit is just making sure that you can wake up in the morning and not hate what you do or just hate the day as soon as your eyes open up.
mhm. Yeah, I think that in universities, they teach Plato as it's a form of rationalism, and I would agree with that. But what that means to be rational, maybe that's where the spiritual Platonists disagree with the academics, because the academics would say that it is just about understanding or just using logical reasoning. But what I think that Plato was really doing, and what I think Socrates was really about, was tapping into the higher realms of mind and knowing ourselves to be divine in essence. And to know the self is really to go far beyond just um, mental activity in the conventional sense of that word, mental, but it's in a higher realm, a divine realm, and to know ourselves to be that, to be no different than the nature of reality. To directly touch that is to know the self.
Do you think they thought that way because of how in ancient Greece or, back in ancient times, there was a heavily kind of influence of what the underworld is, or there's a lot of talking about where you go when you die? So maybe the words or the quotes were kind of, because I think obviously your environment can influence your thoughts, but if you're going to create quotes based on the knowledge that you have at the time, not saying we excelled past religion, but there's a large portion of the population that just isn't religious. So when you look at basic quotes now, a lot of it's about just not wasting time. A lot of it's about grinding or motivation to get your goals. There's not really a religious or deep inner self reflection. More of it's just about like, don't let negative energies hold you down, which is it's a good thing to go
Yeah.
by, but it's nothing that compares to Plato.
Mhm. Right, not at all. Yeah, it's a really watered down version of what wisdom traditions teach. I think a lot of those quotes that you're talking about, they come from Hinduism and Buddhism, but those systems are actually the metaphysics behind those systems, I think, is really quite similar to Plato's metaphysics. The methodology is quite different, maybe in the approach, but the metaphysics behind them all is really quite similar.
Do you think that the
Mhm.
value of the word spoken is only, I guess its value would only compare to the person that speaks those things?
Mhm.
Because I mean, I can be 23 and I could say quotes or
Mhm.
quotes like Plato, and it
Mhm.
wouldn't be taken seriously. It would be taken in a different manner because it's coming from a 23-year-old for most
Right.
people. But if it comes from someone who's like, I'll see Matthew McConaughey say something stupid, Like, all right, all right, all right. That'll get quoted, and people are like, it's a life quote. I'm like, no, it's not. It's a catchphrase.
Oh yeah, yeah. Quote just by itself doesn't mean a whole lot. People are going to project their own meaning onto it. And so yeah, it's very limited in um, how much you can teach in that way. You're not going to change people, I think, through quotes. It's more a way, I use the Twitter page as more of a way to just kind of bring people in and invite them to think about these things. And maybe if someone sees a quote that they find curious, maybe they'll even go back to the dialogue, because I always put exactly where to find it, because on Twitter and in a lot of social media, you see a lot of quotes, but it just says it's from Plato. But it's like I read these and I don't know that quote. That's not Plato. What are they quoting? So I always will put exactly which dialogue and which Stephanus number. So if someone is curious, they can go back.
I
Yeah.
forgot what picture I saw, but it said it was quoted by Plato, but it said do or do not, there is no try. And I was like, that's Yoda. That is straight up Yoda from Star Wars. Like that's not, but you see that kind of happen. But a really like an interesting thought here is with Plato, did he get his fame or did he get recognized for the things that he was doing or the things that he was saying at the time, or did it have to age throughout history? Because I look at it like I think even if we read a quote, like if I put up a quote or something, there'll be people that might read it all the way entirely, but there's people that won't give it the time of day because there isn't that fame aspect, or there isn't that popularity, or there isn't that insightfulness. It's hard to walk into something, especially entering this podcast. It's hard to know what it's going to go to. It's hard to know if it's going to hit a level because you don't know this person that you're speaking to. You don't know this thing. So it's taking a new adventure, really just taking a shot. And a lot of times now, when it comes to risk in society, people don't really want to take those risks because there's more to lose than there is to gain in a lot of aspects of things.
Mm. Yeah, I think also it's kind of surprising that Plato is really as famous as he is, because the way he's taught in universities, quite frankly, it doesn't make sense. Like I took a philosophy 101 class when I was a freshman, and like they taught like the theory of forms as not as these like absolute realities in the realm of mind. What they taught him as is like blueprints in the sky. Like there's a form for tree, and that's why we recognize trees of many styles. And I thought, this is so silly. People were asking, is there a form for computer? Is there a form for car? And it's like, it's so silly. So when I learned Plato, I thought this doesn't make any sense. Or like, I took a lot of political science classes because I was actually a poli-sci major. And a lot of Plato's dialogues have political overtones, but there's actually an analogy going on to the soul, and it's actually not really political. It's only political on the surface, and you have to go work through the analogy. It's a lot of work to do. And most universities don't do that. They teach it as just that surface story, and it doesn't make any sense. And so I don't really know why, but I think in every generation, there are people who recognize something. I don't know why Plato has the recognition he does, because most people think it is that stuff that doesn't make sense. And I think most people just have this idea that they know the name, they know it's supposed to be something really intelligent, but they don't know what he actually teaches. And it is a lot of work to get into. I think a person has to have that hunger to really want answers and to see something of value. And I was fortunate to meet somebody who really understood Plato and was able to introduce it to me in a way that made sense. I was just completely turned off by what I saw in university. And I thought, why do people read this? Why is this so famous 2000 years later? It just didn't make any sense to me. But then when I was introduced to it in a more intelligent way, in a more meaningful way, then I saw how beautiful these dialogues are. And I do think there are many people who want that. I mean, yes, many people, they are too busy and they're not that interested. And so maybe for them, if they find my YouTube channel, maybe if they just wonder, what is the dialogue Theaetetus about? And they'll just, they can watch the video and then they're done and they'll move on to something else. And for a lot of people, that's enough. And so that's fine. I can introduce them to it. But I do think there are people who really want this, who are hungering for it. And those are the people that I most hope that I can reach with my channel.
Do you think that maybe the depression, the rise of that
Mhm,
is causing a not a slowdown, but a more sense or sensitivity to wanting to look deeper into
mhm,
these quotes to try and find meaning or try and find purpose. Like I find myself at
mhm,
times too, you have your ups and your downs with depression. Like my
mhm,
quote that I put up on Twitter was like, they say that with the lows comes the highs. Well, it
mhm,
would it would be
mhm.
better if those lows didn't beat you to your knees. And then I ended with like a funny quote, which totally just erased everything I just said.
Mhm,
But I feel like when you're looking for something, like I talk about an identity crisis with many historians, I
mhm,
talk about, has this always been there? And you start to learn more about your history. You start to learn more that
mhm,
people probably suffered from these things as well, too, just thought of it in a different form. So
mhm,
this idea that it's new, or this idea that today is like the worst time to be alive, it's actually a
mhm,
great time to be alive, because I think
mhm,
with as horrible as depression is, or as people want to use sensitivity as a way of being soft, it's causing you to look deeper into things to
mhm,
find inner meaning, that life isn't
mhm,
just this. I mean, in my history classes, when I learned about ancient Greece or whatever you want to talk about in ancient history, it always boiled down to politics. It was always about the hierarchy of power. And I think
mhm,
maybe he wasn't taken as serious, because the main thing that was on everyone's mind back then was survival, which comes into war. I mean, if you look through any of the textbooks of history, they talk about war like it's a bragging right. Like, yeah,
mhm,
we took this whole entire, we slaughtered this whole entire army. And it's like, we look at it now like, oh my God, they were horrible. It's like, well, at the time, they considered that value, that you were showing
mhm.
strength. Now
Right.
we look at it completely different, which I think
Mhm,
has been a whole entire, our area of focus has shifted to more of a critical thinking in some aspects.
mhm,
It still boils down to politics. And let me tell you, I love it. I like talking politics. Like I wish like it was like the mafia days where you knew who the enemies were. Now it's like take a pick. Like, but you start getting to this point where if you really boil it down deeper than that, you start to understand that there's an overall meaning where we talk about intelligence.
mhm,
Intelligence back then wasn't valued as much as bronze, maybe. I mean, even
mhm,
today, there's still people that seem kind of very intelligent that might necessarily not be. I mean, I'm probably one of those people. Um, but you really
no.
boil it down to the people
Mhm,
that are writing books that I know that are my age, that are just writing deep down from psychedelic trips to
mhm,
help them get there. You start
mhm,
realizing the things that they're reading or the quotes that they're saying, it might come off arrogant from a 20 something year old, but they really resonate true. I mean, they really
mhm,
have some hard hitting stuff in there where someone like my audience is probably in their 40s and 50s. I don't know if it's because they like the conspiracy stuff or they just like that young
mhm,
kid is talking about things that they might not have ever heard before. It's a
mhm,
different perspective. And I think the
mhm,
true, I guess, shift in the sands, I would say, would probably be just understanding more perspectives. I mean, the
mhm,
perspective thing to me is the most fascinating, how people think about things, because you start learning from a different angle of how your mind tackles a situation. I think
mhm.
that's the best part about learning with other cultures as well, too.
Right. Yeah, well, I think that history books do tend to cover wars. And I think even if we're looking at modern history, we do tend to focus on the wars, but it doesn't mean that people in ancient Greece were not talking about this stuff, because like a lot of Plato's dialogues are about Socrates going to the marketplace or going to somebody's house or bumping into a friend, and they end up in this like hour-long conversation. Or there's a man named Xenophon who wrote Conversations with Socrates. It's a book that you can buy. And it shows Socrates talking to like just merchants in the marketplace. And they're not the deep philosophical discussions that Plato wrote, but they present another side of Socrates where he would just like walk around talking to people all day long. And we don't have anything like that now. So it's kind of interesting to hear you say that today people are talking about these things, but back then they didn't, because my image is kind of the opposite. Although I do think that during this pandemic, people have maybe taken a reassessment of their lives, and many people who are just punching a clock every day are rethinking what they want to do with their lives. So this is a good time for people like you and me who are trying to get people more engaged in thinking in this deeper way.
Do you
Mhm.
think, like, if your analyzation of quotes
Mhm.
or just any of the time period
Mhm.
back then, do you think that there was dark quotes that they had too? because I'm trying to find a sliver of realization or relatability, I would say, because it feels like, especially with someone going through the dark times or anyone out there
Mhm,
that's suffering from depression, it just seems like it's secluded to them. And I started to look through old history and finding like similarities that we're kind of basing off of, at least when it comes to arguments or even politics being a top, I guess, a topic that's trending. I'm trying to understand if was there anything that you came across that was kind of a little bit deeper, darker, maybe not deeper into the soul, but more blatant or more kind of like it seemed like there wasn't a light at the end of the tunnel?
Oh, for Plato, there definitely is a light at the end of the tunnel.
Okay.
Um, we find ourselves caught up in, well, like the allegory of the cave, we find ourselves caught up in the shadows on the wall of the cave, and where we're caught up in that show. And that's where we feel that darkness, or we feel like there's no light at the end. But once we can break our chains and stand up and look around and realize that the shadow show is not reality itself, then we'll start to rethink our whole lives and rethink our whole approach to life and the way we've been living and the way we've been thinking about life.
Hmm. I guess I was trying
Mhm,
to search for a root
mhm,
of if there was ever a pessimistic aspect to his personality. I mean, even at a time, you got to think being positive or always
mhm,
having that hope of light at the end of the day, that has to stem from some type of understanding that there is something else after this world.
mhm.
Where I start to look at the religion aspect today, with
Yeah.
there's about
One,
47% of the population that
yeah.
isn't really religious. So I'm like, maybe
Right.
that's where it went.
Yeah. I mean, if you know this physical world to be a part of a greater whole, you're going to look at it very differently. You're going to relate to it very differently. I think people who feel that darkness that you're describing are people who feel that the physical world is all that is real.
Do you think that's also probably why they might care more for the physical world? Like a lot of people that are pushing a giant push for environment
Mhm,
or climate change.
mhm,
There's a big understanding like maybe there isn't a God, but maybe God's everything. God is all
mhm,
around us. And not looking at it like a everybody's God, but looking at
mhm,
it as a way as that this earth, this planet that gives us life and feeds us around us, this is a moving
mhm.
thing that takes care of us. So we might as well take care of it back, which you're seeing a lot
Yeah.
now with kids
Oh, yeah.
caring more for the
Yeah.
environment. I think that's where millennials get most of the crap, is because
Mhm,
they go, "Oh, you're always yelling about climate change." It's like, yeah, because this is
mhm.
the first
Yeah.
time they've ever noticed the damage in real time.
Right. Right. Yeah. It's an emergency in a way it never has been before. But I think there is a misunderstanding that Plato was not interested in the physical world because he focused on what is beyond the physical world. However, I think that when you know the nature of reality and when you know yourself to be no different and you see how the whole is a part of that, when you know everybody to be connected in a sense, that we're all soul, as physical beings, obviously we're separate, but if you know yourself to be that divine essence and everyone is connected, you're going to feel a certain compassion for people. You're going to feel also a compassion for the earth. The earth was considered a god to the Greeks. And so, this idea that they were not environmentally conscious, I think, isn't quite accurate. I think that being a Platonist would make a person more environmentally concerned. But certainly, you don't have to be spiritual in order to recognize, value in Earth and to be an environmentalist.
I could see if you think from the Plato mindset, like I don't
Mhm,
think Plato was probably environmentally or unconscious
mhm.
of it, but I look at like military soldiers. I don't think they really cared about the environment as much. I think Plato was an
Oh yeah.
exclusive rarity, and maybe his followers or people that chose to continue and read his writings probably cared as well too. But
Mhm,
I mean, in the aspect of like, I think Plato was one of those kind of outcasts in a way. I don't
mhm,
see him fitting in with most of history. So I wonder if
yeah.
it,
Mhm,
did he, if you look at the concept of caring about your individual person, how can
mhm,
you, I mean, maybe I'm taking my perspective and analyzing it, trying to put it back then, which might have been different, but if people are making fun of you and considering you crazy for your
mhm,
writings and not understanding the things that you say,
mhm,
you would look at them like how Da Vinci probably looked at people like, you guys don't understand, you guys are of lower intelligence, so it's hard for me to understand the caring aspect for their fellow man when
mhm,
you might be mistreated in a way, or you might have a misconclusion of each
mhm.
other.
Well, he recognized those errors as ignorance, which is different from a lack of intelligence. That was really what the allegory of the cave is pointing to, is the idea that if you mistake this physical world for all that is real, then you're going to reach your logic is going to take you to conclusions that are false. And it doesn't mean that you're lacking intelligence or that you lack the ability to follow logic. If A is true, then B must follow. But your premises are wrong, and your assumptions that you start with are wrong. And so there was a certain education of the soul that was needed in order to gain wisdom. So it wasn't that he thought people were just stupid or he didn't care about them. I mean, if he believed that, there'd be no reason to open his academy. There'd be no reason to write the Republic, which is really, I think, the closest thing to a spiritual guidebook that he's left us.
It's more of a misunderstanding, but I'm
Mhm.
wondering if that seclusion is what made him think this way. I'm wondering if his thoughts, they say that healthy people technically seclude themselves from others, mostly because there's just a misunderstanding. So and that could be turned the other way too. You could be a psychopath and want to seclude yourself from others.
Mhm.
But I'm looking at a concept of
Mhm.
if there's that misunderstanding that you just don't connect with the people around you and you choose to spend a lot of your time alone. Like I think a lot of the alone moments in my life help me think a little bit deeper into things and help me
Mhm.
get a more of a critical thought or more of a deeper thought in a way rather than just going with the basic normal. I'm wondering if that's what might have enhanced his thoughts or his intelligence is spending that time alone or spending
Mhm.
that time in seclusion, kind of like the hermit tarot card. That's what that's really about as well too.
Um, yeah, I don't know how much time he spent alone. Unfortunately, we don't have as much information about his private life as we would like. But I know that Socrates died when Plato was about 28 years old. So he had Socrates as a teacher up until that point. And then he traveled for some 12 years and he worked with different teachers. So it wasn't just that he like went off in the forest by himself. It was he was working with different teachers. He worked with a dialectician, he worked with some Pythagoreans and maybe some others. We don't know everyone he worked with. And then after some 12 years, he returned to Athens and he opened his academy. And so then he was always interacting with people. And so I don't know. I'm sure he did spend time alone. I think he was probably an introvert, I would guess. But
With
he
his
also worked with teachers. Mhm.
with his opening of the academy,
Mhm.
was there a large curiosity or a large general public, I would say, that were trying to enter this academy just out of curiosity, or was it more of like a very selected few?
My understanding is that it started rather informally with just small numbers of people, but then it quickly started to grow and grow until eventually he decided to make an official academy.
Hmm. Because I'm wondering if the general public was curious. Because I think once you open up a
Mhm.
building, for instance, you can think
Mhm.
the way you think, and you can, talk and speak philosophy quotes or, deep insight onto things, and the public really won't give you the time of day. But if you really open up an academy or schooling with an actual concrete brick and mortar building,
Mhm.
that's when we start seeing people actually curious into maybe this person is actually selling something that actually might be, even if it's not for profit, if it's just for deep insight onto things, selling things in a concept of a way to enrich your soul, you start to take it more seriously.
Um, yeah, I think many people probably would. But then again, Socrates attracted many people to him as well. Like he didn't have a school. He basically just walked around barefoot in the marketplace talking to people. And he had a huge following or I don't know, huge, but he had a following. And it was significant enough that the people, those in power, felt threatened by him. And that's why he was executed. So I
Well, he was a
really,
wordsmith. I mean, if you're
Mhm.
thinking about from a military perspective or the king's perspective, the guy's walking around barefoot and he's convincing people. You can see where that leads to, which
Mhm.
is not
Mhm.
maybe necessarily where it was going to. I think just the perspectives were different. The king looks at it as a military aspect, but this person could change my whole town against me. And he was looking at more like I'm trying to enrich the town and understanding that there's more than just this basic being that we are.
Mhm. Yeah, yeah. And I'm sure like even like today, are people curious about this? Well, it depends which people you mean. It depends who you hang out with, who's around you. And I think it was probably very much the same in ancient Greece, that there were people who were quite interested. There were people who were perfectly satisfied just working their 9 to 5 job or whatever their work hours were in those days. And, just the basic family life, and that was enough for them. So, but I'm sure, there always will be people who have these sort of questions, who enjoy these sorts of conversations. And so they'll seek out a person like Plato, whether he has the informal gatherings or he has the formal school. But the school was open some like 300 years.
Mm.
So it did attract quite a large number of people ultimately. Yeah.
I just start picturing pillars and then one person
Mm.
sitting there with that common picture. I don't know if it's who it is, but they have that common picture of it's like a guy holding a triangle and a toga. And it's like something they always put some motivational quote on top of it, but there's like it looks like he's in space in a way, but there's just a coliseum around him. And I'm like, I don't know what that means, but it always either gets referenced to Socrates or Plato or some type of philosopher from back in the day that might not be, 100% accurate, but in a concept that's supposed to help people get the gist of it.
Mm.
Do you like through your research or through your just
Mhm.
learning about this, is there anything that you just found that you could not find an answer to or you just couldn't understand?
You mean something in Plato that I couldn't understand, or a
Sure.
question of my own?
I guess a question of your own.
Well, I think I'll always be a student. I mean, now I've gotten to the point where I feel like I understand this enough that I can introduce others to Plato.
Mhm.
I can talk about his dialogues, I can talk about the meaning behind them. But that search for the self is one that's still going on. I don't claim to like be a, fully enlightened Socrates. There are still those questions. So there's always that depth that I'm always seeking.
Did it seem like
Mhm.
Socrates or did it seem like Plato in a way found themselves or do you think they were still searching?
Um,
Because Leonardo has one of my
that's a
favorite
good question. Mhm.
Leonardo da Vinci has probably one of my favorite quotes, which is art is never finished, just left undone, because he always
Yeah.
believed you could add on to something.
Mhm.
And I really find that, yeah, because I'll do like a painting or something. Then when I come back to it after all the paint's dry and I'll
Mhm.
add something, it just keeps getting better and better and better. And I
Mhm.
think that's with anything that you do, you can keep adding on to it.
Right. I imagine there's a depth that you never quite reach the end, I would imagine.
Hmm.
Mm.
I'm just
I imagine
curious.
even a Socrates. Mhm.
Yeah, if Plato was coming up
Mhm.
with such amazing quotes, giving kind of advice to be able to find yourself, I'm curious to if he ever thought that he found himself at a certain point.
Well, I think there's a point where you find some answers and you can always go deeper, but there's certainly a point. I can say for myself, I can't speak for Plato, but for myself, there's a point where I feel like I'm going in the right direction. Um, the Much of Plato's dialogues can be built around the virtues, and one of the virtues is wisdom, the idea of knowing thyself, to know the nature of reality, to know yourself, to be no different than that nature. And the deeper that we penetrate that, the deeper that it's a transformation of our state of mind. Um, I think the way the virtues are taught in universities, they're taught as behaviors. And so when you think of them as behaviors, then as a reader, maybe you're looking at Socrates and you're trying to figure out his behavior. And from that, extrapolate what the virtues are. And what ends up happening is that we project our own state of mind onto him. Like, for example, it was very common in his day to have a young male lover. And there are apparently a lot of young men who try to um, seduce Socrates. In fact, there's one dialogue that's kind of like a kind of comical scene where one of these young, attractive men is telling the story of how he tried to seduce Socrates and he failed over and over again. And so many people read this and maybe they themselves would think that it would be, good, high status, and it would be exciting to have, a good looking lover, much like today. We still have that same image of like wealthy people or people of status. It's a status symbol to have,
I
a
mean, if I could
lover.
sleep with Brad Pitt, I'd sleep with Brad Pitt, but the status.
Yeah.
I,
But so people look at that and they read that and they think if they themselves would like that, then they think, oh, so temperance means like suppressing your desires. And so there are lots of assumptions like this. They get this whole laundry list of ideas of what people think the virtues are. What they actually are, though, are states of mind. And when you understand them as states of mind, then you see that philosophy is not just about reading things or just thinking about some interesting quote or something. It's actually a transformation of the soul. It's like as you go through this, as you think about this deeper, it actually is about a transformation of your state of mind. And so, like the state of mind of a Socrates, someone who knows the nature of reality, who knows himself to be that, who doesn't just have a conceptual idea that we're more than physical, but who has direct recognition of that. I don't want to say experience because I'm sure you've talked to people about peak experiences. They're technically not experiences if there's no subject and object. It's a oneness. So it's a recognition. And to have that direct recognition, to have the state of mind of courage, which is where you are not being distracted by pleasures, you're not frightened by fears, you're focused on the nature of reality and what is healthy for the soul. And temperance as a state of mind is, I won't go into it, but Plato presents the soul as having three aspects, and we can discuss them if you want. But for now, let's just say there are three aspects, and temperance is when those three aspects are in a certain harmony and unity, so that you are single-minded. You're not torn in this direction and that direction, chasing every whim. Instead, your desires are only focused on what is healthy for the soul, or at least not unhealthy. And then the state of mind of justice is when those three parts of the soul are each doing their own proper function and functioning as one whole. And then together, you take those four, and then you have one whole state of mind. Imagine a Socrates, that state of mind. It's very different from where you or I are at, but as we move along, we're moving closer to that state of mind. That's really what the philosophical life is. It's not just taking our current way of being and thinking, oh, this is an interesting quote. How does this fit into my current life? There's something far more transformative about philosophy.
kind of like for me, when I spend my time alone or I spend my time thinking about something, I try and recognize what unnecessary evil I'm adding into my life. You know what I mean? Because we all do something that necessarily might not be good. For me, my New Year's resolution, I think everyone has that New Year's resolution of being like, oh, I'm going to cut this out because I know it's bad for me. You understand that that's evil. It's just necessarily, you're giving your life a day or a timeline of how long you're able to do it until that. And there's no more of that. For me, it was cutting out coffee. And I've been getting the worst freaking headaches from it. But it's a step in the right direction. I want to end up cutting out all energy drinks because 16 a day isn't good for a normal person. But that's a different discussion. But it's recognizing unnecessary evil in a sense where you're trying to find balance. I mean, being able to wake up in the morning and like who is looking back at you in the mirror.
Yes.
I think we all have those kind of neglecting thoughts or types of feelings, but it's about how loud that voice is turned up. We all have that thought that's a question or maybe a self-criticism in a way. For some people, it's up to 10. For others, it's down at a 1 because in a sense of their state of mind, they're not letting that overconsume their state of mind or their state of being.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Also, at what side of Platonism that I think a lot of people are not aware of, what he's often not associated with, is not only the pursuit of what is true, but also we have to tear away false beliefs. And a big part of his teaching is that we have to question our own assumptions. We have to
Critical thinking.
recognize what is false, because if to know the self, you also have to know the false self-image. You have to be able to distinguish the two. And so a big part of Platonism is also about recognizing your own false beliefs. Some of them are things like maybe drinking too much caffeine. I don't know if that's a false, maybe that you need it. I don't know. But the false beliefs that I think are the evils in our lives, if you will, would be things like our insecurities, or maybe you were raised to think that you should value the practicalities of life. And so for a person who's pursuing philosophical questions, it may feel like a waste of time. You may tell yourself, there may be this voice in your head saying, this is all interesting, but you're not making money doing this. And so that gets in the way of growing healthier. And so those are the kinds of unhealthy beliefs that I think are more dangerous.
The
That the
true
ones
trick
that we
is
need to
trying to
have.
get people to
Yeah.
understand those are unhealthy beliefs. People
Mm-hmm.
will be in a relationship even though they might be getting abused, all because they say that they love this person. Now
Mm-hmm.
that's might be a false belief in your eyes, but to them it's the truth.
Oh
You know,
yeah, that's
trying
very
to get
real.
that's the
Mm-hmm.
one thing I understand about, like, especially diving into like the UFO stuff as well too. There are people that their
Mm-hmm.
reality is just completely different, but I enjoy that experience. But it's so hard because you can't back down someone else from their belief or whatever their
Mm-hmm.
reality is, because that's all
Right.
they know.
Oh yeah, you can't just talk somebody out of a belief. You can't even talk yourself out of a belief.
Yeah.
I mean, like the idea of, like, take the practical one, the idea of being practical. So you can see conceptually why this might be a limiting belief, but if you were raised on this, even if you're drawn to philosophy, even if you're drawn to these deeper questions, that voice is still in your head. And so the way to tear it out, it's not just to talk yourself out of it. You have to actually, um, you have to meditate on it. You have to work on it. You have to keep, there actually are methods. The teacher that I work with is Dr. Pierre Grimes, and he is not only a brilliant philosopher, but he also happens to be the founder of the philosophical counseling movement. He's in his 90s now and still just as sharp as can be. It's amazing. But he first published back in 1953. He did some work with alcoholics, helping them understand why they first had that urge to drink. And from that work, then he started publishing on philosophical counseling. And so I've had the benefit of also working with that aspect of philosophy. And I think it's a really important one because we have these sorts of blocks. Like, you can't just talk yourself out of loving someone, right? Like your example was. But you can look at what are the images of that. What images does that person satisfy? Because there's something unhealthy there, and yet you're drawn to it and you feel you love this person. That means that there are images that you're drawn to.
Kind of like graduation goggles. A lot of people, when they leave high
Mhm.
school, they don't remember the moments of pain. They only remember the good parts about that. Same thing with the
Yeah.
relationship. After a week or two, you don't really remember the bad times. You start to remember only the good parts about why you enjoy this person, then realize how much the
That may be
relationship is
part of
toxic.
it.
Yeah.
Yeah. But like the false beliefs we hold, I think there is an amnesia aspect to it, but I would say that it's because the experiences we had as children, we drew certain conclusions about the world around us from our interactions with our parents. When you're 4, 5, 6 years old, your family's all you know,
Yeah.
and you don't question them, and you don't have that ability to analyze, is mom wrong or is dad wrong? You just accept whatever they say on face value, and that becomes your sense of the way things are. And that's what shapes us. And so we have to go back, and then we have these experiences where we draw these conclusions, but they're so mundane that we're going to forget them. I mean, how much do you remember from when you were 5, right? So you don't remember the experiences, you just walked away with the conclusion. And it's become such second nature that it just feels right. And so even when you tell yourself, even when you have as an adult that conceptual insight that this is wrong, it still just feels right. It's such a deep level. And so that's why we can't just talk ourselves out of it. And so we have to find some way to return, at least mentally, to that experience. and be able to analyze it. And that's much of what philosophical counseling is about.
Do you think that people
Mhm.
base value in things of when it comes to the amount of objects, or maybe the amount of, like, if we're going to consider value of someone's self, it never really boils down to, for a lot of people, or at least the public in a way, to things inside of yourself, or a little bit of self recognition. For me, I consider value like having billions of followers or having this,
Mhm.
even though I don't know why I'm obsessed with that, but that's just been ingrained into my head of what success is, because media
Mhm.
has always shown you that that's what success is,
Right.
rather than just finding value in the people. Like, had a I had a dream about Jesus. Like I said, I'm not religious, but he said something to me, and it
Mhm.
kind of resonated deep. And it was more like, would you rather be remembered by everyone for a second, or would you rather be remembered by few forever? And it was kind
Mhm.
of like what I pulled out of that was trying to find. My dreams are like intense, but they get like some
Mhm.
deep hitting quotes at times. But it made me kind of realize, like, I have a small group of people that I've connected with through the show that are
Mhm.
really there 100%, and I know I could count on them. But
Mhm.
compared to, if you look at trying to get everyone just to know who your name is and not
Mhm.
think of Robbie Robertson as a guitar player, um, it's a different thing. And I think I base my value on something that isn't everlasting. I think if
Mhm.
you want to be remembered, you should be remembered by the people who truly actually care about who you are, not just like the image of the person that's being presented.
Mhm. Right. Yeah, that's like that transformation that I was talking about. Like maybe when a person first comes to philosophy, they very much have those worldly values. But as we start to look at ourselves and think about things more deeply, it does happen that this transformation occurs when we do start to question those worldly values. I would say that, like, I've been doing this for a little over 20 years now, and I would say that I am now um, less
Twen
vain
20
than I used to
years?
be.
How freaking old
Hmm.
are you? You look great. I don't know
Oh,
how old
thank
you are, but
you.
holy crap.
Yeah, actually, I'll have a birthday in about 6 weeks. I'm going to be turning 50, big 50
No way.
way.
Good on you.
Yeah, I don't feel 50. 50 sounds old, doesn't it?
I mean, I think we
It
look at
sounds
it now,
old.
like, I think everyone's living to be like 100 on this. So I'm like, I don't think that's old anymore.
Really? Mm. Well,
You look
thank
great.
you. Thank you.
He said 20. That just caught me off guard. I was like, wait a minute, hang
Oh,
on a second. I'm
mm,
freaking 20. I will be three,
yeah.
basically. Um, I really, I know I just threw us off topic, but I think when we look at like the basic understanding of this whole entire thing, the timeline, for instance, the timeline from when Plato first, his first quote, or whatever that is recorded, is there a basis off of when his first quote was compared to what his last quote was? Because I'm wondering if anybody has noticed a change in the way that he's been maybe saying things or looking at things. We all, I think, every day think a little bit differently than the day
Mhm,
before. We're never exactly the same exact person,
mhm,
whether it's an interaction that changes us. I'm just curious, is if he always had the same mindset or same goal, or has it kind of changed or morphed in a way, either covered up a little bit or maybe
mhm.
released a little bit?
Yeah, I imagine there must have been growth, but it's really hard to say because his dialogues are generally divided into early, middle, and late. And the early dialogues are basically just kind of like presenting questions. Like they might raise a question like, what is virtue and can it be taught? And there'll be a little discussion about it, but no conclusions are reached. When you get to the middle dialogues, that's where a little more meat is put on it. The dialogues get a little bit longer. The Republic actually addresses those questions finally. And then the late dialogues are looking more at like the implications of all of this. But it doesn't mean that he wrote them in that order because he was developing. I think that's often the way it's taught in university. I think it's more accurate, though, that the early dialogues are for the students early in their practice. Initially, you should just think about these questions, and then you get more into the meat of them. And so it was designed that way for the students, which means it's really hard for us today to assess what was his growth from when he first started writing until his death.
Do you think
But
that
it's an interesting
Do you
question.
think
Yeah.
that a essence of it might be lost in a sense that trying to translate it from its original text over to a
Mm,
more
that's
understandable
definitely.
form might have?
Mhm,
Because I mean, if I say something compared to someone
mhm,
repeating something I said, it doesn't have the same
mhm.
impact.
Right. Right. Yeah. And the translations can differ greatly. And also because a lot of translators, even though they're obviously great at Greek, they don't necessarily have that spiritual background to appreciate what he was doing. And so they may sometimes, their own lack of insight into the actual substance of the dialogue might obfuscate their meaning with the words that they choose in their translation.
Kind of
So
like
that's a problem as well. And there are certain words also that don't translate well at all, especially spiritual words.
Yeah, kind of like conversation back in the day has more impact than conversation today in a lot of aspects because our conversation has been, I would say, false communication, which is now through social media, doesn't have the same impact as, a friend talking to you or someone in
Mhm.
person having a conversation with you. Even a Zoom call kind of helps out a little bit, but it makes you feel charged up depending on how the conversation goes. But a message with blank text, it has words and you understand what those words mean, but the feeling is lost.
Yeah, and also tone is lost in writing.
Yeah.
And I know that's always a problem for me because I tend to be very direct, especially in writing.
Mhm.
And so sometimes I may come across harsh,
Yeah.
more harsh than I
I
mean
know what you're
to.
talking about, yeah. I have someone that
Yeah.
voice texts, and it always comes off like they're yelling, and I'm like, "Why are you so angry?" They're like, "No, I'm just telling you, you gotta do this." I'm like, "Okay."
Yeah. So yeah, definitely a lot gets lost in social media, I feel.
If you could say that through doing this channel or anything that you're willing to, I guess, work for to inspire or maybe try and pull out for a lot of people that wanna view this thing, um, what would you say would be the ending goal for you on it?
For me, learning has always been, I've been one of those people who always wants to be surrounded by people wiser than myself. I love learning from others. It's
Sorry
far
I
more
couldn't help you.
interesting than being the knower. I know a lot of people like to play the knower, but I actually find it very hard. So, but I think it's something that's important to introduce other people to this way of approaching Plato. I think that there are people who are just so hungry for this, and so if I can introduce people to it, and I think also it's meaningful that we have this kind of wisdom tradition in our culture. We don't have to go to the East. We don't have to go to Buddhism or Hinduism. We actually have this depth of wisdom tradition right here in our culture. And a lot of people don't know that. And when they discover it, it's really an amazing find for them. And I see that excitement in others. And I remember that excitement in myself when I first found it. So that's one of my goals, is that I do want to introduce people to the system. And I'm happy to help people as they're reading the dialogues. If they have questions, I always invite people to ask me questions. But my real goal, I guess, I want to keep learning. I want to keep growing, and I really don't know where it goes, but I just feel like it's the right direction.
I find it that the things that people always look at is like, oh, that's obscure, or that's kind of weird that you like to learn that type of thing or do that type of thing. I find that it's actually pretty easy to spark curiosity for a lot of people. I just think it's about the method that you use to be able to do so. Podcasting, I think, sparks up a big I guess curiosity, at least probably during the pandemic, it did. It kind of dropped off after the pandemic. But I think video creation or content creation, you start to look at a lot more educational sources, which
Mhm,
I find is actually better than schooling in some aspects, depending on what content you look at, only because
mhm,
it's more adaptable for people that want to like learn. Like I'm an insomniac, so I like to learn at 1 o'clock in the morning. Like I like to be watching videos or deep
mhm,
Rome or ancient Greece folklore or
mhm,
something like that really, really late. And I find that I can't go to when I go to school, or when I did go to school, it was a little bit
mhm,
different because it's kind of like college. college, you learn the things that you want to learn. Besides taking the basic classes, you get to pick where you want to go with your career. And I think that incentivizes people to want to focus more rather than being kind of taught things that they necessarily might not care about, even though they're basic functions.
Mhm.
I wanted a Greek mythology class in high school and I never got one because they don't really teach a specific class on that.
Mm,
That's an
mm,
extracurricular type thing.
mm. Yeah, I think one of the great things about social media is we can use it for education. I mean, we hear about all of the negative sides of social media, but actually, it really depends how you choose to use it. And there is great opportunity to learn anything you want to learn.
I need to stop searching up
Mm.
government stuff on my social media. Good God, I keep getting that bad algorithm. I'm like, oh my God, the world's horrible. Um, Mindy, I appreciate you giving me your time to do this podcast. Is there a place people can find you if you want to say your YouTube, your Twitter?
Yeah, yeah. On YouTube, I have a channel called All About Platonism. And that's where I'm going through all of the different dialogues. And then once I finish those dialogues, I'm going to go into some different themes, like going more into the metaphysics and so on, and also how to practice. Also, if I can, I have a book. This is
Discovering
this
the
is put out
beauty
by
of
the Prometheus Trust. And let me try to put a little closer.
it's
Um,
discovering the beauty of
Discovering
wisdom.
the Beauty of Wisdom. And in this book, I go through a lot of the metaphysics and the various teachings of Plato, but also how to actually apply this to our lives so that we can have that transformational experience and benefit from it. So if anyone is interested, the publisher is the Prometheus Trust. If you go to their website, there's information about the book, and it's available directly from the publisher. Most areas of the world, it's a British publishing company. So Europe, Asia, in Africa, it would be available directly from the publisher. There is a link for how to order the book in North America if you're in the US or Canada. And so you can find it all on the Prometheus Trust website. It's prometheustrust.co.uk.
And I'll make sure I link it in the description so people
So
can
there's the
be
book.
able to click on it. But Mindy, I appreciate you giving me your time and everything. Is there anything you want to say before we wrap up the show?
Oh, just thank you very much. I really enjoyed talking with you.
And stay
Thank
tuned
you
for
for
another
having me.
episode of Out of the
Mhm.
Blank Podcast.